Hey there everybody, and welcome back to another Blender tutorial. I know this one's a bit late, but I was sick and am sick and I lost my voice. Long story short, we're making jellyfish. This is the important shit. So here I have a geometry nodes jellyfish. Of course, for my original one I made it a bit better, but with the materials, oh yeah, it just looks so good. And it turns out that a jellyfish is actually super simple to make. Our game plan is the cap of it is going to be like half a sphere that we're going to distort, and then we're going to have tendrils coming down with certain rules. And after we do that, we're going to have a jellyfish. Let's begin. In geometry nodes, take everything, delete it, and replace it with a cube. And what I'm going to do is, like I said, start with a UV sphere. I feel like I'm croaking, just trying to talk. I want to take the sphere and turn it into a hemisphere, in other words, cut it in half. To do that, we can either use a delete geometry, or what I find is a lot simpler, is we use a separate geometry node, which will let us take the position, so I'm separating based on how tall, in a sense, it is on the z-axis, right? So we take the z-axis, plug it in there, and if we use a greater than node to kind of filter through the height, we can now pick a selection of the hemisphere. So again, we have a sphere. We are separating it into the section that is greater than, the z component is greater than some value. And as we increase the resolution here, that is going to be more fine of a division. And we can actually get the inverse, which is not useful for us. Okay, so I'm just going to take the part that is bigger than 0. And the reason I want to do that is because now when we transform it to make it a bit flatter, it's going to scale on the XY plane because there's nothing below it. I'm struggling here, boys. So I'm going to flatten it, and now the next step is to have it oscillate and like pulsate. It's probably a better word. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a set position node anytime we want to change the position. Your boy's struggling. Anytime we want to change the position, we use a set position node. I want to offset it by the normal, but not everywhere. It's going to be based on a selection that we are going to dictate the strength of using this scale. So you can see this controls how much this is growing based on the normal. To make a map for this, I think what I'm going to do is I want a map that tells us how radially out we are. So it starts here, and then it grows out radially, and that's going to tell us how much to pulsate depending on the position there. So I'm going to take the position, I'm going to extract the length of it, and this length can be plugged in right here, and what it should be doing, I guess we want the XY length, so it doesn't actually care about the Z coordinates. It's like we're projecting from the top. So I'm going to multiply by 110, there we go. Now we have a pulsating, not pulsating, we have a deformed thing. To get it to pulsate, all we have to do is manipulate it over time. So I'm going to add to our gradient. So you can see what this looks like is it kind of just grows. And I want to have this be repetitious, so I'm going to send it through a fraction, and now we get something a bit more close to what we want. It's pulsating in the wrong direction and a bit too fast, so I'm going to make a negative and 0.5 to make it twice as slow. And then to have it not have this kind of like discontinuity, where it's basically the fraction, it's either 0 or 1 right on the boundary. So we have a 0 to 1 thing, and then on the boundary it goes from 1 to 0 very quickly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a color ramp to soften that. So it's going to be black on both edges, and somewhat brighter in the middle. And we can use easing. So now we have something that looks a bit better. We basically just made the wave modifier, in a sense. Okay? Second part of this is making the tendrils. But I guess before we make the tendrils, let's just make this thing a bit more detailed because it kind of looks a bit plain. So what I can do is I can set position, I can offset specifically on the z-axis, and what I care about is taking this rim, which is a circle, and making it wavy. So to do that, I can take a radial gradient, which is just going to give us the angle as we go around, so going from 0 to 1. I want to take the radial gradient right there and feed it through a noise. So basically our noise is going to change as we go around. And then feed that into the combine XYZ. See what that gives us. Yeah, now it looks a bit more like a cloth. To make it less intense, especially in the middle, I want to take this length from before. So I'm going to capture this length attribute, bring it over, and now it doesn't look as awful. So let's see, it's going to be doing this by 0 in the middle, and then it's going to increase. We can modify this with a color ramp. Let's see, if I bring this slider up, this will soften the transition a bit. Let's use some easing. That looks awful. We're going to take this, and instead of rising it up, we're going to multiply it by -1. So it's kind of like draping instead. So we took the rim, and we said bring it downwards. And we can, again, soften that transition and make it less intense. And this just adds a bit of shape to what we're doing. Also, there's no reason we can't up the detail on something like this. We do want more rotational segments, I believe, to get this to be a bit cleaner. And now we have this effect, which I think looks pretty cool. Now what we want to do is make the tendrils. And I know what you're thinking, why don't you just distribute some points for each one, drop a tendril? You're going to notice that the distribution of points is going to change. It's going to be pretty similar, but it's going to change. This is because the mesh is pulsating. There are ways around this, but what I'm going to do, and I don't know if ID would help, using an ID mask. No. There are ways around this, I believe, like distributing before and then casting the points. To keep it simple, remember that our jellyfish is actually made of points, so we can use those that are already oscillating for the thing. So I'm going to instance on points. What am I going to instance? A curve that goes downwards. So it's going to be like draping downwards. And I don't want it to be everywhere. I want it to be based on a selection. So we can actually use our length from before and ask where is it less than some value. So this is going to grow out radially. So we want something like that. And we can multiply this so it's not everywhere by a probability, so a random value. So each point gets a number between 0 and 1. And that number, let's actually see what we're doing here. That number will dictate whether or not it spawns a thing. So I'm saying only keep like 2.7% of the points. Okay. Some other things we can do is randomize the scale. So I want this to be, I guess we could do a complicated function for this for now. Let's isolate the z component since that's what we care about. I'm going to use a random value, so it can go between 0 and let's say like 4. And now when we take this and join it with our original mesh, we get a jellyfish with tendrils. And now the name of the game is to make them look distorted and all this. To do this, I'm going to resample the curve, give it like 30 points each. So you could think of this as each curve has 30 points. And I'm struggling here, boys. What I want to do is distort these. So I'm going to use a set position node. Anytime we want to change the position, we use a noise texture. I guess we have to realize those instances as well, so it's actual geometry. Center the noise. And scale it. The trick we've been using for decades. So I'm going to make a low frequency noise. And we can make it this, instead of just like a random coordinate system where it just distorts, what we can do is we can make this relative to the index, which I think is pretty cool. So like we'd type in index here as the what do we call it, the coordinate space. And as we animate this over time, I guess it's looking pretty weird. Do I want this to be 3D? Something like that. I'm just playing with the settings to get something that I like the look of. I think we need a very low scale. There we go. Now we're getting a bit closer. So I really want low frequency detail. And now if we animate this over time, it's going to be kind of in respect to the tendrils in a sense. So we're going to make this relative to time. Let's give our curve some thickness. Curve to mesh. And for our profile curve, we can use a circle. I'm sorry, I'm not talking that much. I really can't. But if I don't do this, I'm going to fall more than 2 tutorials behind. I'm fine being a day behind, but 2 tutorials, it's like, whew, it's going to be a bit rough. Okay, so I want to set the curve radius so it's not all the same everywhere. So this is going to be kind of like our thickness in a sense. We don't need this many points. This is something we can randomize. So you can see now it's looking a bit chunky. One interesting thing is if you interpolate this by the domain of the spline, each spline will get its own thickness instead of varying by point, which I think looks pretty good. So I'm just going to bring down the thickness. By the way, since these points are poking out, I think there's 2 things we can do. I think first line of defense is we can make them very thin at the top so you don't see them. So I'm going to multiply by the spline parameter. And you can see that I got rid of most of it, so the factor is 0 up here, and then it grows as we go downwards. That kind of helps. I think another thing we can do is we can just move the points before they get instanced. So I'm going to set position, offset by the normal, which makes it look crazy. Never judge a book by its cover. And we can scale it negative a bit, so it's going inwards. And now we have fixed the thing. I'm thinking that the random scale doesn't look too good. I'm getting more water. I want to have a bunch of tendrils that are like some 0 to 1 length, and some of them can be like way longer, right? That's the idea. So I want to kind of color ramp our random value for the scale. So to do this, I'm going to map this 0 to 1. And instead of going from 0 to 4 like it was before, 0 to 1 times 4, which is effectively the same thing. But the nice thing about this is 0 to 1 works with color ramp. It actually also works with the RGB curves. Let's do that instead. And what do I want to do? I don't want this to be 0 to 1. I want it to be like 0 to whatever. Yeah, and there are some long tendrils too. I didn't even think about that the first time I made it. So I'm just like shaping the curves here. Okay, awesome. I guess I did add a bit more detail in my original. So I'm going to set position again, use another noise texture, use this. I'm just trying to wrap this boy up as fast as possible. What I am doing is I'm adding a second line of noise using the same technique. And I want this to be of higher scale. And this one's just going to like really add a bit of variety here. I think that looks good. Only other thing we could do is we could add some pulsating to the tendrils as this pulsates, but I think that's a bit much for now. I want to work on the material. And by the way, this is poking out a little, so I'm going to bring down the scale. Bring it down a little. I want to work on the material. The material is actually super simple to make a jellyfish. You want to use a set material node. And, I'm going to set up an HDRI environment, which seems weird, especially since this is supposed to be an underwater scene. Whatever. Environment texture, HDRI. There we go. So now our jellyfish has some lighting. Okay. And let's see. We can go to the shader editor, use this material, so now it's a link to it. So whatever we do to this material, it's going to transfer over. Here's the trick. Transmission, bring it up. So it's glass. Bring down the roughness too. It's already kind of looking like a jellyfish. Pick a color that's jellyfish-like blue. Make it a bit subtle. And then the last part is you want to take a Fresnel, kind of a clamped Fresnel, and multiply it by like some big number, like 5 or something. I know, huge. We take this, use this as the emission strength, and bring up the emission to some color. This is going to add glow to the edges and make this look super cool, as you can see. Yeah, that looks awesome. We could also add a bit of clear coat. And the final thing is we want to put this bad boy underwater. So I'm just going to make a cube, give it a material. Here's a simple underwater shader. Take a principled volume, connect it to the volume, bring down the density so we can actually see what's going on, and pick a oceanic kind of color. So something like this, and I think the final step is to bring down the entropy, whatever it's called. Something like that. And you can take your jellyfish, duplicate it, rotate it. You can have a little jellyfish field. Let's denoise so we can see what's going on. A little hard to tell. But for the rest of the scene, I just positioned, jellyfish and stuff like this. So I think I need to wrap up. I can't talk. But I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Blend file in the Patreon and also in Gumroad description. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I feel better tomorrow.